boxing the bleeding head off him, kicking the bleeding leg off him. Usual side dive to close the distance. This is not over. If we had to take this outside with him, it's all outside. We don't give a...
There will be another UFC champion. There will be another knockout artist. Another superstar will eventually sell millions of pay-per-views. And someday, another fighter may even become bigger than another Conor McGregor. Not because he was the greatest fighter who ever lived. And not because nobody can ever match his achievements. The reason is much more complicated. Conor McGregor arrived at a very specific moment in MMA history. The UFC was growing rapidly. Social media was transforming how athletes connected with fans, and the sport was searching for a personality capable of crossing the boundary between hardcore fighting and mainstream entertainment. Then Conor appeared. He wasn't simply another talented prospect. He understood attention. He understood promotion. He understood psychology. Every interview felt like part of a larger story. Every press conference became an event. Every fight carried a narrative. And when the cage door finally closed, he had the ability to back up an extraordinary amount of confidence with elite level performances. That's what made the phenomenon so difficult to replicate. Plenty of fighters have been charismatic, plenty have been confident, plenty have been devastating inside the octagon, but very few possessed all three qualities at the same time, and even fewer arrived when the sport was ready to turn that combination into something enormous. McGregor didn't simply participate in the UFC's rise, he became one of the most recognizable faces of it. Suddenly, people who had never watched a UFC event knew his name, they knew his voice, they knew his personality, they knew his opponents, and most importantly, they wanted to see what happened next. That's when Conor stopped being just a fighter. He became a spectacle. But the most fascinating part of the story is that none of this seemed inevitable. Before the championship belts, before the record-breaking events, before the global fame, there was simply a young fighter from Dublin trying to convince the world that he belonged. And that's where the story of Conor McGregor really begins. Before Conor McGregor became one of the most recognizable athletes in combat sports, there was a version of him that very few people outside Ireland knew. A young fighter from Dublin with enormous ambition, but no guarantee that the world would ever pay attention. McGregor's early journey wasn't built around fame, it was built around obsession. He committed himself to MMA at a time when becoming a professional fighter didn't come with the guarantees that exist today. There was no certainty of UFC stardom, no promise of championship belts, no massive global audience waiting for his next fight. He simply believed he could become one of the best, and that belief became one of the defining characteristics of his career. From an analytical perspective, what made McGregor different wasn't simply his confidence, it was how specifically he understood his own strengths. He developed a striking style based heavily on timing, distance, movement, and counters. Rather than constantly chasing opponents, he often waited for them to enter his range. Then he would punish the opening. That left hand became one of the most recognizable weapons in MMA, but the weapon itself wasn't the entire story. McGregor understood how to create the conditions for it. He used movement, feints, angles, psychological pressure, and an ability to make opponents react before the fight even began. That last part would eventually become incredibly important because McGregor wasn't only preparing to fight his opponents physically, he was preparing to fight them psychologically. He wanted them thinking about him, thinking about the predictions, thinking about the pressure, thinking about what would happen if he was right. And as his confidence grew, something else happened. People started listening, then they started watching, then they started believing. By the time McGregor entered the UFC, he wasn't simply another European prospect looking for an opportunity. He already carried something extremely valuable, a belief that he belonged on the biggest stage. But even he couldn't have known how quickly that belief would turn into something much bigger, because once McGregor entered the UFC, the sport was about to discover a completely different kind of superstar. When Conor McGregor entered the UFC, the organization had already seen plenty of talented prospects, but almost immediately something about him felt different. He didn't behave like a fighter waiting for his opportunity. He behaved like someone who believed the opportunity already belonged to him, and then he started winning. The performances against Marcus Bramage and Diego Brandão helped introduce him to a wider audience, but the real transformation came as the level of competition increased. McGregor wasn't simply defeating opponents, he was creating moments. moments. Every victory seemed to carry a larger narrative. Then came Chad Mendes. For McGregor, this was a defining test. Mendes represented the kind of challenge many believed could expose him, a powerful wrestler capable of taking the fight away from his preferred striking range. But McGregor survived the difficult moments, adapted, and eventually stopped Mendes. That victory wasn't just another win, it proved that his confidence wasn't completely built on fantasy. He could perform under the pressure of a major fight. Then came the moment that changed everything. José Aldo had held the UFC featherweight championship for years and entered their fight as one of the most respected fighters in the sport. McGregor had spent months predicting exactly what would happen. Many people dismissed the confidence. Then the fight began. Seconds later, Aldo was knocked out. The fight lasted just 13 seconds, and suddenly, the entire MMA world had to reconsider what McGregor actually was. He wasn't simply entertaining. He wasn't simply good at promotion. He was an elite fighter who had just produced one of the most shocking championship victories in UFC history. But the knockout itself wasn't the only reason the moment became legendary. McGregor had predicted it. He had built the story. He had convinced millions of people to watch. And then he delivered the ending. That combination was incredibly rare. Most fighters could provide the performance. Some could provide the entertainment. McGregor had learned how to provide both. And that was the moment when the UFC realized it had something far bigger than a champion. It had a global superstar. The José Aldo knockout made Conor McGregor a champion, but it didn't fully explain how he became a global phenomenon, because by this point, something had changed. McGregor wasn't simply selling fights because he was winning them, he was selling stories. Every opponent became a character. Every press conference became part of the build-up. Every prediction created another reason for fans to watch. And McGregor understood something that very few fighters had mastered at that level. Attention is part of the fight business. He knew how to create anticipation long before the opening bell. His confidence could be outrageous. His insults could be personal. His suits, entrances, interviews, and celebrations became recognizable parts of his identity. But underneath all of it was an important strategic advantage. People cared about what happened next. That transformed the economics of his fights. Casual sports fans who might never normally watch a UFC event suddenly had a reason to tune in. They didn't necessarily understand every technical detail of MMA. They understood the story. They wanted to know whether McGregor would actually do what he said he would do. That became one of his greatest weapons. And then came the challenge that could have ended the entire narrative. Nate Diaz. McGregor suffered a submission loss in their first fight, and suddenly the image of invincibility disappeared. But instead of destroying his popularity, the defeat created another storyline. Could he recover? Could he adapt? Could he beat Diaz? McGregor returned for the rematch and won a majority decision. Then came perhaps the biggest achievement of his UFC career. He moved up to lightweight and defeated Eddie Alvarez to become the UFC's first simultaneous two-division champion. That moment represented everything that had made McGregor unique. The confidence, the ambition, the risk, the performance, and the ability to turn a sporting achievement into a global event. But there was something even bigger happening. Conor McGregor had crossed a line few fighters ever cross. He was no longer simply one of the biggest stars in MMA. He had become one of the biggest stars in combat sports. And once that happened, there was no going back. There was a moment when Conor McGregor stopped being simply the UFC's biggest star. He became the center of the entire business. And that distinction matters, because becoming champion is one achievement. Becoming the fighter everyone wants to see is something completely different. At his peak, McGregor had that power. Every announcement created headlines. Every opponent became part of a larger conversation. And every event involving his name felt bigger than a normal UFC card. The clearest example came when McGregor stepped outside mixed martial arts and entered the boxing ring against Floyd Mayweather Jr. From a purely sporting perspective, the matchup was controversial. Mayweather was one of the greatest boxers of his generation. McGregor was an MMA champion making his professional boxing debut. On paper, the experience gap was enormous, but commercially, the fight became massive. That was the McGregor phenomenon. He had reached a level where his personality alone could turn an improbable matchup into one of the biggest combat sports events ever staged. And even though Mayweather ultimately won, McGregor had already accomplished something extraordinary. He had convinced the world to watch. That was his real superpower. He understood how to turn uncertainty into anticipation, how to turn criticism into attention, how to turn an opponent opponent into a storyline, and how to make people emotionally invested before the fight even started. But this period also revealed the other side of unprecedented fame. The bigger McGregor became, the greater the expectations became. Every fight carried enormous pressure. Every loss became a global headline. Every setback was analyzed far beyond the octagon. The same spotlight that helped create the phenomenon eventually became part of the burden. And that's important when discussing his legacy, because the story of Conor McGregor isn't simply about success. It's about what happens when a fighter reaches a level of fame that almost no MMA athlete had experienced before. At his peak, McGregor didn't just represent the UFC, he represented the possibility that an MMA fighter could become a global celebrity on a completely different scale. And once that possibility had been proven, every fighter who came after him entered a sport that he had helped fundamentally reshape. But every extraordinary rise eventually creates a difficult question. What happens after you've reached the top? For Conor McGregor, the answer became complicated. The fighter who once seemed almost unstoppable began facing a different kind of challenge, one that couldn't be solved simply by throwing another punch or learning another technique. The expectations had changed. Every comeback became an event, every defeat became international news, and every appearance was judged against the version of McGregor who had conquered the UFC at his peak. His losses to Khabib Nurmagomedov and later Dustin Poirier showed something important. The sport had evolved, the competition had evolved, and McGregor's opponents were no longer simply trying to survive his striking. They were studying him, they understood his tendencies, they prepared for his movement, they attacked his weaknesses, and the margin for error at the highest level became smaller. Then came injuries and long periods away from competition. Each absence created another question. Could the old Conor come back? But perhaps that's the wrong question, because the most difficult part of McGregor's story isn't whether he can reproduce the exact fighter who knocked out José Aldo. It's whether anyone can realistically reproduce the circumstances that created that version of him in the first place. The sport changed, the UFC changed, McGregor changed, and the audience changed with him. That's the paradox of becoming a legend. The moments that made you famous become the standard you're constantly compared against. For McGregor, the 13-second knockout, the 2-division championship, and the enormous crossover success became almost impossible benchmarks. But none of that erases what came before. His legacy was already established. He had shown that an MMA fighter could become a mainstream global celebrity without abandoning the identity that made him successful inside the cage. And perhaps that's why his later struggles make the story more human. The phenomenon wasn't permanent. No phenomenon ever is. But the impact it created, that was. There will be another UFC champion. There will be another fighter with devastating knockout power. There will be another charismatic personality who captures the attention of millions. And perhaps one day, another fighter will become even more successful than Conor McGregor. But there will never be another Conor McGregor, because his legacy isn't built around one statistic. It's not simply the championships. It's not the knockouts. It's not the pay-per-view numbers. And it's certainly not the trash talk alone. The phenomenon came from the combination of everything: the timing, the personality, the confidence, the ambition, the fighting ability, the promotional instincts, and perhaps most importantly, the moment in history when all of those qualities came together. McGregor understood how to make people care. He could turn a fight into a story, a press conference into an event, an opponent into a villain, and a prediction into a moment the entire world waited to see. That's incredibly difficult to manufacture. The UFC can develop another superstar, the sport can produce another champion, but trying to deliberately create another Conor McGregor would almost miss the point. Because Conor wasn't created in a laboratory, he emerged from a specific era, with a specific personality at a specific moment when MMA was exploding into the mainstream. That's what makes his story so unusual. His career may not have followed the perfect path. There were defeats, injuries, setbacks, and questions about what could have been, but none of those things erase what he accomplished at his peak. He changed the expectations of what an MMA fighter could become. He showed that a fighter could control the narrative before entering the cage. He showed that personality could become part of athletic greatness, and he helped transform UFC fights into global entertainment events. That's the real legacy. Not that Conor McGregor was perfect, not that he was unbeatable, but that for a brief and extraordinary period, the entire world was watching one fighter. And that's something the UFC may never see again. There will be another champion, there will be another superstar, but there will never be another Conor McGregor.